My topic is the value of science and values in science. So many an internet troll has recited the cliche, facts don't care about your feelings. In a similar sense, many have thought that science and values can have nothing to do with each other. Science being the realm of hard, objective facts, and values being the realm of subjective whims and desires, of bias and partisanship. But it only requires a little bit of reflection to see that there cannot be a complete separation of science and values. Science is a human practice, which we value enough to make it central to education, to rely on it in many of our personal and public decisions, and to devote significant portion of our social resources towards. Some people value science so much that they devote their lives to it, right? But we want to know, why do we value it so much? Should we place the value on it that we do? Also, science is an activity engaged in by human beings, or rather, as an activity engaged in by human beings. Science is also guided by values, right? You might ask, which values? How is it guided by values? And these are some of the things I'm going to explore in this talk. I'm going to explore some of the interplay of science and values. I'm going to begin with the attempt to understand the value of science itself. To add some concreteness to the discussion that follows, consider the case of climate science. Climate scientists try to understand the workings of the climate system, a system that's large, that's complex, and that's chaotic, and about which there's necessarily going to be a lot of uncertainty. The climate system has a major impact on a variety of things that humans care about, from the quality of our summer vacation to food production to the viability of whole regions of the world as livable human habitat. Over the last several decades, there's been a significant and growing consensus among climate scientists that human activity is a driving force in significant changes to the climate system, most famously, rise in average global temperatures. Climate science aims to understand, predict, and to propose interventions to mitigate the effects of these human-caused changes. Right? And we want to ask, is this kind of science valuable? And if so, why? Is it valuable because it helps us understand the natural world? Is it valuable because it helps us anticipate problems that affect human lives? Should our values, ethical values like concern for human well-being or concern for the environment, ethical values like liberalism or environmentalism or freedom, should these have an influence on climate scientists, or other values? Should those values have an impact on climate scientists and how they do their work? What about economic values, for example, like growth and stability? Should climate science be value-free? Should it be neutral or impartial with respect to things like ethical, political, and economic values? Should it be focused purely on creating an objective understanding of the climate? So hopefully that, and I'll come back to that example several times to help us give a little bit of concreteness to some of these abstract questions. So start with part one, the value of science. Philosophers of science, that's the perspective I'm coming from here. Philosophers of science have tended to focus on questions about how science works, taking for granted the significance of science itself. Right? As Paul Feyerabend provocatively put it, now 50 years ago, philosophers of science have long debated a variety of answers to the question, what is science? But they have hardly ever asked the question, what is so great about science? Right? And that's our question for the first part of this talk. Another version of that question is, why should we value science? We shouldn't rest easy with the sort of uncritical assertion that we just should value it, right? Because it's obviously great, right? We should not take that for granted. And of course, we know that anti-science attitudes are alive and well in corners of philosophy, in other areas in the humanities, and in many parts of society at large, right? So, if we think it is valuable, we need to be able to explain and defend that value. It's also not plausible to think that science is the kind of thing that's just intrinsically good for its own sake without any further analysis, right? Very few things are good in that way, right? Maybe things like pleasure and absence of pain, or satisfaction of our interests and desires, autonomy, basic rights, those might be intrinsically good. I think even the value of those sort of things is open to argument, and in some cases may depend on further considerations. But even if we take, something like that to be sort of intrinsically good without analysis, most other things are valuable for some further reason, for something else they provide, or on some basis. And it seems like complex human practices are mostly like that, right? Their their value, intrinsic or instrumental, is open to further explanation, analysis, justification. For example, democracy, its value could be articulated in terms of how it relates to autonomy, or its protection of basic political rights, or perhaps that it's likely to further our interests, collective and individual. But it's not just sort of a value simplicator, right? Even art, right? And lots of people value art for art's sake. Why it is valuable is open to analysis. Maybe, and many analyses have been given over time. Perhaps art provides experiences of pleasure or sublimity, or it provides an opportunity for one to express oneself, or it challenges preconceptions, or captures ultimate meanings, or something essential about the human experience, right? Not that any one of those explanations is necessarily right, or um, uh, we may not come to agreement. But what I want to emphasize is that um, it stands in the possibility of analysis and justification, and science, I think, is like that. So, in order to understand the value of science, as with any practice, we need to understand how the practice works and what it results in. In other words, I think we need to answer two questions. What are the aims of science, and what counts as as success in science? And with the answer to those two questions, we can then evaluate the value of what science does, or what it produces, when it successfully meets its aims, right? It would also be, of course, worthwhile to know how often it is successful by its own standards, right? Though that's sort of an empirical question, and one that's beyond the scope of this talk. So I'll start with a common view about the value of science that I will call realism. Many different kinds of views, answers to different kinds of questions go by the name scientific realism. Many of them are semantic or metaphysical or epistemological theses that don't have much to do with questions about the value of science or the aims of science. Still, this view that I'm going to articulate is in some way in a family with those other views, and I think realism is the best term for it. So according to realism, science aims to answer specific questions about the way the world is. When it is successful, science provides answers to those questions that accurately represent some part of the world. That is, it answers those questions by providing something like a true theory, or a model that fits very well with a part of reality, or a causal hypothesis, or a description, right? The criteria for judging accuracy are generally understood to be empirical, having to do with careful observations and experimental tests, though they might also include theoretical criteria like simplicity, or aesthetic criteria, maybe like elegance. Such criteria are themselves sometimes conceived of as values, right? And so they're relevant to this larger conversation. They're typically called epistemic values because they're values that are concerned with knowledge, right? So there are several problems, I think, with the realist answer, as I've characterized it, to the question of the value of science. The first is that there seems to be a diversity of different aims and practices in science, not all of which can be reduced or explained in terms of accurate representation. So, different parts of science seek to do things like improve health, protect the environment, meet our energy needs, feed populations, protect human safety, and so on. Right? It takes complex and frankly implausible philosophical contortions to describe what biomedical science is doing as representing the way the world is accurately when it is focused on producing medical interventions that are in fact judged by how they change, that is, how they improve human health, right? Our kind of example du jour of climate science, right, is similar. Some activities, yes, are concerned with representation, but many of them are concerned with policymaking, right, with mitigation and adaptation. In a similar way, accuracy is not sufficient as a criterion for judging scientific results. At best, it's one criterion among many, and typically we will find that it trades off against other criteria that we also regard as important. Already, when we start to talk about theoretical criteria like simplicity and elegance, it seems like we may be talking about something that goes beyond accuracy. But in addition to wanting accurate results, we want results that are timely. We want results that are obtained in resource efficient ways. We typically want results that minimize the risk of harmful errors to the people who are going to use those results. Or that will minimize, say, in the case of medical research, harmful side effects. In many cases, it's actually more useful to have a somewhat simpler and less precise or less accurate model that better helps us understand what is going on or is easier to use, less, say, computationally intensive. And when we do research using human subjects or animal subjects, protecting the well-being of the research subjects or the rights of the research subjects become criteria by which we rule out some methods entirely, even when those methods might produce more accuracy. Perhaps the most significant concern about realism as an account of the value of science is that it sort of kicks the can down the road only a short distance. It doesn't advance our inquiry much beyond the just uncritical assertion that it is good, right? The reason I say that is that I think it's not at all clear why answering questions about the way the world is and getting accurate answers to such questions is itself valuable. So it just sort of pushes the question to this question, what's valuable about accurate answers to descriptive questions? The realist just sort of asserts that it has value, right? And thus makes very little progress on the topic. In other words, I think the problem is it's coherent to ask the further question, what's so valuable about that, about such answers, right? Surely there are many such questions that answering doesn't really provide any value. We could ask, how many dust particles are on my desk at just this moment, right? How many hairs did Julius Caesar have on his head the day he crossed the Rubicon, right? How many milliseconds did it take me to utter this sentence? The problem is not so much that such questions are unanswerable, it's just that it is impossible to justify expending resources, time, effort, funding, whatever, on even partially adequate answers to such questions. It's hard to say that such questions or the attempt to answer them are even scientific, right? Even though they are perfectly legitimate descriptive questions that presumably have descriptive answers. How is understanding the climate system different from such trivial questions? Right? It's unclear on the grounds on what grounds the realist could justify such a difference. Right? Okay, so I think the realist answer to the question of the value of science is unsatisfying. As I've said, in part because of the diversity of scientific aims, practices, and criteria for success, and in part because it's open to this sort of further question argument that it seems to lack the resources to answer. Um, so you might be wondering, how general are these problems? Given the diversity inherent in scientific activities, is there anything general one can say about the value of science? Will that any answer we can give avoid such a further question objection? I think so. I think I think a view that is sometimes called pragmatism, sometimes called instrumentalism, although I think the view I'm going to talk about is not closely associated with what's usually called instrumentalism. We can understand the core of science in a way that accommodates these issues. We understand science as a process of inquiry, as a kind of problem-solving practice, whose aim is to provide powerful tools for solving problems that arise in practice. According to pragmatism, scientific problems are continuous with practical problems in that they concern how we are to accomplish our various goals. Science does not pick out one or a small number of specific types of problem. Scientific problems in this sense are not sharply demarcated from problems of an everyday sort or those in specialized non-scientific fields. I think at best, recognizably scientific questions are those that tend to be more systematic or more general or more technical or perhaps more empirical, open to empirical investigation. But mostly we call inquiries scientific when they are part of just a pretty focused and specialized field of inquiry. Of course, among our goals are a desire to predict, to explain, to control the world around us. Those goals are pretty recognizable in the scientific practices of observation, theorizing, experimentation, and technological application. But as we've seen, those are just a few of many goals that scientific inquiry promotes. In the case of climate science, these include attempts not only to understand the past impact of human activities on the climate system, but to predict the future development of the climate under various choices we might make for the future, and to recommend choices, policies, and technological interventions that can meet various goals that we have, like mitigating climate change or adapting to its effects. These aims are made significant by the various impacts a changing climate will have on human lives and other things that we value. Scientific problem solutions are judgments about what to do, how to act, or what to build in order to overcome obstacles and accomplish the various goals that spur inquiry in the first place. As problem solutions, rather than merely answers to questions, they recommend or require doing something that responds to the problem. And this gives us our criterion of success. Science is successful when it actually clears the obstacle out of the way and helps us accomplish our goals. The criterion is obviously contextual in that it depends on what problem inquiry is trying to solve. It is also practical in that it involves not merely an intellectual feature of the representation, but a change in the practice-world relationship where the problem in our practice gets resolved, or at least mitigated to the point where we can move on. Right? So the value of science under a pragmatist view is found in its power in providing successful solutions to our problems, in providing means that allow us to achieve our ends. Unlike the realist, the pragmatist has no problem answering the further question, which parts of the world are worth understanding, right? It's those that interest us and that bear on our goals. our other goals. There is no further pressing argument. What is so valuable about achieving our goals, right? If there were, they would not be our goals, right? Though certainly there's plenty of further argument to be had about which goals we should adopt, whether a specific goal is a worthy goal. But that is an argument that falls outside the philosophy of science itself and is just a matter of practical reasoning of various kinds. However, this means, I think, quite clearly that on the pragmatist view, our personal and social values play a deep role in science itself, in its aims and in its standards of success. And so it is to that role that I now turn. So we moved from the value of science to part two, values in science. And we'll talk again a little bit about these so-called epistemic or scientific values. But by values, generally, I mean the sorts of considerations that play a significant role in ethics, morals, politics, religion, art, prudence, economy, considerations about what is good, right, rational, or preferable, and about what is bad, wrong, unreasonable, undesirable. There's a broad sense in which value judgments are uncontroversially play a role in science. They're kind of uncontroversially pervasive. In that, some research proposals are judged more promising than others. Some experiments are considered better than others. Some methodologies are considered altogether wrong. It's a wrong approach. These are questions of better and worse. They're value judgments, right? The question is, are such decisions to be guided and evaluated entirely by values internal to the practice of science, or should, say, our social and personal values also play a role? And that's where the controversy comes in. So on the realist view, remember, science aims always and only to discover the truth about the natural and social world, to accurately represent reality, right? On such a view, it's plausible to think that judgments about what is right or best in scientific practice should only be guided by that aim, right? And so only scientific values, values internal to the practice of science, values that serve that aim of accurate representation, should be at work, right? These are the values that are sometimes called epistemic values, to indicate that they're knowledge promoting values or truth promoting values. Oops, no. Okay. There's a sort of natural connection between realism and a view I'll call naturalism. So, we've been talking about realism in the sense of realism as a view about the aims of science. But another sort of view called realism holds that science not only aims at, but actually achieves true or approximately true knowledge about mind-independent reality, right? So realists about the aims of science are also often realists about the achievements of science, though they don't have to be. The converse of this second kind of realism is naturalism, the view that the reality of the world is just what successful scientific knowledge discloses it to be, right? So if realism tells us that what successful science discloses is real, scientific naturalism tells us that there is no real beyond what successful science has or will disclose, right? Realists of both sorts are often naturalists in the sense, though it's coherent to be a realist but not a scientific naturalist, and possibly vice versa. Now, note again, just like I said, there are many different meanings of the word realism beyond how I use the term in this talk. There are also many different uses of the term naturalism. The naturalism I'm talking about here is sometimes called reductive naturalism or scientific materialism. The view that someone like John Dewey calls naturalism, for example, is not covered by the sense of the term as I'm using it now. Okay, so because values are not objects of natural science, and because typically they're understood subjectively by the successful social behavioral sciences. Values are understood as a kind of cultural belief or a psychological attitude or something like that. The realist and naturalist tend to understand reality as disenchanted, as devoid of values, right? If the world is devoid of values and science aims at depicting the truth about the world, then the reasoning goes, values ought not to play a role in science. Um, the claim that science ought not to play a role in science is sometimes called the value-free ideal of science, or just the value-free ideal. Um, the idea is that since only the search for truth or accurate representation ought to guide our inquiries, and values are not part of the world to be depicted, values, at least the values that don't directly promote accuracy or truth, ought, in the ideal case, to play no role in science. Now, I think it's relatively clear. Um, well, I mean, I'll just say briefly, it, the argument doesn't really follow, right? That is to say, just because the subject matter of natural science or social science doesn't feature values as sort of independent entities, doesn't mean that values don't play a role in the scientific process, right? In much the same way that microscopes are not the object of study for biologists, but nevertheless, biologists use microscopes to study biological phenomenon of various kinds, right? So, nevertheless, I think it's clear why such a view is compelling to the realist and the naturalist, right? When making decisions in science, the naturalist might say, a consideration will either lead towards the truth, in which case it's a good candidate for an internal criterion of science, or it won't, in which case it can at best be neutral, but will more likely be misleading. Right? Some opponents of value neutrality or the value-free ideal have tried to make a kind of realist-friendly argument that the space of neutral or even truth-promoting influences for values is actually much larger than it might seem at first, right? And some of those arguments have been very effective. For example, the argument from inductive risk that Heather Douglas has pursued is an argument of that kind, that there are many sort of um, influences of values on science that are neutral with respect to whether it promotes the truth, right? Um, on the other hand, I think as we've seen, Ames realism as a view about the aims of science is open to pretty difficult objections. I think, although I will not go over them for sake of time, there are similarly difficult problems for the achievement realist and the scientific or reductive naturalist. Um, so, how do things look for the pragmatist? For the pragmatist, scientific inquiry is a practice of problem solving, as we've said. Maybe it's really a system of such practices. But as a practice, it consists of various sorts of actions like articulating problems, proposing hypotheses, collecting evidence, conducting experiments, asserting results in a talk or a publication, right? Some of the acts are routine, right? But others require deliberate judgment about how to proceed, right? Um, Either way, they depend to some extent on practical reasons that motivate and justify those actions. Indeed, I think it's a quite venerable view in the philosophy of action that what distinguishes an action from other kinds of just natural happenings, natural events, is that actions are explained, motivated, and justified by reasons, by practical reasons. And as far as I'm concerned, practical reasons is just a different way of saying values. This much the realist could and generally does accept, right? They insist, however, that the only relevant values are scientific epistemic values. But the pragmatist would go further, would kind of push back on that and say, first, there's a diversity of goals and criteria for scientific problem solving, right? And those goals and criteria are as are dependent on rather than autonomous from the social context in which science is embedded. So there's no good reason to insist that only internally determined scientific values apply. There are many sort of contextual social values that play a crucial role. Um, Second, for a certain sort of pragmatist, and I would count myself among them, these sort of epistemic values or scientific values that are typically described are actually not really practical reasons in the right way. They're not action guiding practical reasons of the right sort to fully explain, motivate, and justify scientific practices. Right? So, for example, empirical accuracy is certainly a very good thing for a theory or model to have for all kinds of reasons, right? It is itself a kind of crucial characteristic of a good theory that it is empirically adequate or accurate. But that doesn't tell you how much accuracy one needs before, for example, making the decision to conclude data collection and publish results, right? How accurate does it have to be to take that action? The value of empirical accuracy can't tell you. Similarly, logical inconsistency is a property that it's generally bad for a theory to have, right? Um, uh, being not well formed or being contradictory is not a good thing, right? That's fairly uncontroversial. But that will not prevent scientists from publishing or making use of theories that include, for example, equations that mathematicians regard as ill-defined, equations featuring delta functions, for example, or even logically inconsistent theories, such as the Bohr-Sommerfeld model of the atom, which was used for some years, even though its logical inconsistencies were known, and can still be used in limited applications, right? If the scientists have good reasons, other good reasons to do so, um, just the badness of logical inconsistency doesn't tell them what they should actually do. The sorts of epistemic values that realists point to tend to be good reasons for or against claims, right? But they're not sufficient practical reasons for actions. Actions like um, concluding a study, asserting a view, asserting a hypothesis, or using a theory to do an experiment. When we talk about values in science, value judgments guiding science, what do we mean? What kind of roles are values supposed to play, right? And there's a wide variety of these. It may not surprise you to know, right? Um, if I choose, for example, to pursue a certain hypothesis in my scientific inquiry, I need to know not only that the information, so I need to know the information that makes that hypothesis seem plausible, but I also need a reason to pursue it over others. Perhaps I think that this hypothesis is more likely to help me achieve certain goals, or it is most likely to guide fruitful experiments, right? Or maybe it's the safest option for securing funding support, right? Its epistemic characteristics have to be coupled with practical reasons of those kinds. If I'm deciding whether I have enough evidence to publish my results, or strong enough evidence to publish my results, The strength of the evidence by itself cannot make the decision for me, right? I need further reasons to consider that amount of evidence sufficient. I need to ask, is this enough evidence to lower the risk of being wrong to a tolerable level, given the ethical, social, or reputational harms that might accrue from asserting results that turn out to be erroneous, right? Would waiting for further evidence itself have bad consequences, including delaying a solution to the problem this inquiry was meant to solve, or allowing a competitor to get credit for making the discovery first, right? There's a wide variety of ethical, prudential, personal, social, and other values that may play a role in such decisions, have to play a role in such decisions. Now, most of the time, scientific researchers, like the rest of us, act out of habit and training rather than making an explicit decision on the basis of rational calculation or what have you. And that's necessary if science is to proceed and not to slow to a kind of snail's pace. And it's to the good insofar as the habits and sort of social conventions of science are formed by thoughtful attention to the relevant values and are also sensitive to changes in a situation that might require reconsidering those habits and conventions. Insofar as we act thoughtlessly with respect to the values that motivate and justify our actions, I mean, in science, but also anywhere, right, in any part of our life, we're liable for criticism of acting recklessly or acting negligently. When we act, we are responsible for the reasonably foreseeable consequences of our actions, even when we're not thinking about those consequences at the time, right? Um, if a reasonable person could realize that they were making decisions that would harm others, or making decisions that would violate or disrespect the rights of others, or would cause damage to what others would value, then thoughtlessness is not a defense. The fact that it didn't occur to me that it was a problem is not a defense, right? Um, and so there's sort of certain kind of basic moral obligation um, uh, to think ahead, right? Um, at least as an ideal, we ought to practice thoughtful foresight with respect to our actions, right? This is a pretty ordinary ethical responsibility, and it's just as important in science as elsewhere. Indeed, I mean, because of the relatively um, significant power of science to affect the world and to influence decision makers, scientists should be especially careful to think through what they're doing and to make wise value judgments that guide their decisions and actions. In prior work, I've argued that moral imagination, as conceived of by John Dewey and others, should inform our approach to value judgments in science, precisely because it's geared towards thoughtful foresight. Another consequence of the pragmatist recognition of the central role of values in science is that it opens the door to the ethical and political critique of science. If all sorts of values do and ought to motivate and justify decisions in science, and if scientists are responsible for the foreseeable consequences of their research activities, then it follows that those activities and their results are open to evaluation and critique on the grounds of values, on ethical, political, and prudential grounds. For the realist naturalist, as we've seen, ethics and politics are seen as most likely to lead away from the truth, right? And thus, ethical and political critique are unwelcome impositions on science. On that kind of view, scientists should have unrestricted freedom to 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 inquire, right? Unrestricted freedom to pursue the truth come what may. Now, we might make exceptions, right? We do make exceptions in the case of research, as I've said before, involving human subjects or animal research subjects. We rule out research protocols that would cause the subjects of research harm, even when uh, they might achieve better accuracy, right? So the realist can acknowledge that. We might even insist on some restrictions concerning research whose results could be particularly harmful, like research that would help us create biological weapons or something. Um, or so we might say, you can't publish um, openly instructions for creating harmful viruses, right? Um, but okay, those are sort of for the realists, those are the exceptions that prove the rule, right? Those sorts of side constraints on research aside, science ought to remain above ethical and political critique. For the pragmatist, on the other hand, such critique is appropriate when directed at the goals that scientists seek to forward, directed to the criteria they've applied in justifying their problem solutions, as well as whether they have properly constrained their actions according to their possible consequences. Right? Seeking the truth is not by itself alone sufficient motivation for pursuing a line of inquiry. And accuracy is not by itself alone a sufficient criterion for success. Why do we seek to solve this problem rather than that one? That's a question about prioritizing various goals, decisions about allocation of scarce resources like grant money or just researchers' time, um, and involves deliberation. That question involves deliberation about the likely side effects of the knowledge gained, right? Is this going to produce goods or harms? Um, those are things we have to think about, and those are ethical and political types of questions. Should we accept this solution to a problem, right? I mean, that definitely depends on the quality of the evidence for it, but also whether the actions that the solution requires are acceptable. Are they acceptable in our society? Are they consonant with our various other aims? Now, just because there are tensions there that arise, that doesn't mean we necessarily reject the solution automatically, right? Um, but it can, because it can lead us, I think, also to reevaluate our aims and social values. And we should approach that with an open mind with what science has to teach us. But we still can use those as grounds for critiquing the criteria of success, particularly when there's serious consequences if we act in that way. This doesn't mean that anything goes, right? This doesn't mean that any critique of science is fair game. That one doesn't like some scientific results or wishes they had come out differently is not a good reason to critique those results on itself. To come back around to our climate example, fossil fuel producers may wish that the overwhelming evidence did not point toward the fact that carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels is causing significant climate change. They may not like that the models the models they may not like that the models suggest that the consequences of climate change will be quite harmful for things that we all care about. But they can't reject them without engaging more directly with the aims that justify the research and the value criteria in play, right? It's not enough that we would like it to be otherwise, right? To make a convincing critique of climate science, fossil fuel interests would instead have to argue in something like the following way. Climate science focuses a lot of research effort trying to understand changes in the global climate system as a result of human activity. And in particular, the future harms that could accrue to human lives and property, as well as to biodiversity and ecosystem health. As a result, climate science causes reputational and economic harms to the fossil fuel industry, which in turn leads to loss of jobs and um, uh, decreased return on investment, decreased income from fossil fuel extraction. These priorities are unacceptable, right? As the lives, welfare, and rights of future generations and present and future ecosystems and non-humans are much less important than the financial well-being of large fossil fuel corporations, whether those are private corporations or state-run entities. What matters is the sort of financial well-being of those corporations and the jobs in those very specific industries. Okay. Remember, this is a hypothetical argument that I'm making, right, on behalf of the fossil fuel producers. What's more, the solutions, this is continuing in the fossil fuel producer's voice, the solutions that could possibly address the problems that climate science identifies involve, for example, reducing consumption of fossil fuels and replacing fossil fuels with alternative sources of energy. These sorts of solutions unacceptably infringe on things like individual rights to spew whatever they want into the shared environment, or they unfairly favor carbon neutral industries or carbon negative industries. So things like individual rights or concerns of competitive fairness or the significance of sovereign wealth funds for various nations are much more important than things like ecological stability, the integrity of the agriculture system, the welfare of future generations and current humans in the future, and all the other things threatened by climate change. Okay. So as horrifying as those things I just said may sound to many people, no doubt that sort of makes the defense seem like a bad satire. But I think that sort of extreme argument is precisely the sort of thing a comprehensive attack on climate science as such would require to be legitimate. That doesn't mean there certainly is plenty of room for reasonable people to disagree, both on how to prioritize the problem of climate change or different parts of that problem, with respect to other major social problems. There's plenty of room for reasonable people to disagree about what sorts of solutions are acceptable or preferable. Different views in this range would lead to reasonable and legitimate ethical and political critiques of specific priorities and approaches within climate science. But only views that seem wholly unacceptable on ethical or political grounds, views like the ones I was just sort of attempting to hypothetically articulate, could justify complete climate denialism or wholesale attacks on climate science. And this is generally true. The legitimacy of the ethical and political critiques of science that pragmatism not only implies, but I would argue endorses, does not justify a generally anti-science attitude. Indeed, I think reasonable and responsible ethical and political critiques of science, if scientists were responsive to them, would likely make science better, would make it work better, and would increase support for it in society. And that's where I'll end. Thank you for listening. I look forward to any comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. From now on, it's a Q&A session. I appreciate any questions from the audience.
Okay, I'll start.
Yeah, please.
Yes. Okay, so Matt, I think your your talk is very important in terms of foundationalism. I mean, the ethical foundationalism of why we're doing what we're doing. And I also like to note there's a very practical importance, the value of science. Say, for example, populists around the world now see are strongly alienated from the basic procedures of science, precisely because, in large part, they don't see the connection between the ideals of scientific accuracy and life, the problems we're facing. And those populists have a kind of, sort of, I would say, popular pragmatism. They're not concerned about truth for its own sake. There's like, okay, we're losing our jobs, society is coming apart, so why the heck are we spending all this money on universities? Why not just, bulldoze them or whatever? So this, I think, is extremely important, but also theoretically important for all the reasons you gave. I'd say that I think I'd sign off on all the things reasons you've given. I'm personally a Peircean pragmatist, but I kind of Dewey adjacent too, so I can go with that. What I'm interested in is wondering about your response to the leisure-based view of science, which we find in Aristotle when he says in Beginning of Metaphysics, we desire knowledge for its own sake because when we don't have anything to do, we're just looking around. Or you can take the example of someone who's a prisoner and they have nothing to do. They might study biology all day. They can't do anything with it practically, but it's valuable to them. So what do you think of that sort of like leisure approach to science?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, there's an older view, this would be like a late 18th, early 19th century view, that it's really only like men of leisure that you can trust to do science because they don't have a personal stake in it, right? And so the sort of the image of the gentleman scientist that we get from that period is a view about scientific objectivity in a way, right? So I mean, I think I have two kinds of thoughts about that. One is nothing that I'm saying should be taken to conflict with the fact that for the practitioner of science, there is a certain kind of you might say aesthetic value to the practice itself, or you could just say an intrinsic value to the practice itself. Scientists tend to just enjoy the thrill of inquiry, right? And the pragmatists, I think, especially Peirce and Dewey, both in different ways, have moments where they kind of articulate this very feeling, right? If the primary value of science was the sort of personal thrill, the personal sort of aesthetic, or you might even say quasi-religious value that, or edification, maybe that's a better word for it, that one gets out of doing it, that alone wouldn't justify, right, the immense social investment in the practice that we in fact have, right? It definitely would, it justifies the kind of 18th century like personal investment of gentlemen in their own personal laboratories sort of approach, but it does not support the tens of billions of dollars in giant infrastructure projects and, CERN, Large Hadron Collider, the Genome Project, these kinds of things, right? But it's not to say that it isn't also real, and it is. In fact, it can explain some of the problems that we see in science, right? Robert Oppenheimer articulated a concept which Heather Douglas has written about, the technical sweetness of pursuing a scientific problem, right? Which in later reflections, Oppenheimer took as one of the explanations for why none of the Manhattan Project scientists thought too much about the consequences of what they were doing once they were sort of fully engaged in the project. The other thing I'll say is I think, Aristotle's conception of science or philosophy, of knowledge, is one that comes out of a very hierarchical society, right? Where the thinkers and the doers are different classes of people. Dewey, I think, is very incisive on this point, right? That Plato's and Aristotle's conceptions of knowledge owe a lot to the fact that they were, the wealthy gentlemen of a slave-owning society, and that there were the slaves and the artisan class were like lower class people, right? And so, sort of leisurely contemplation, rather than workmanlike experimentation is sort of crucial to the concept of knowledge that they had. Yeah.
So let me just follow up, because I think your responses are very much to the point, at least in terms of the classical leisure theories, whether of Aristotle, late 18th, early 19th centuries. And it's interesting you brought up the Large Hadron Collider. There's actually the example I was writing in my notes as a good example. But let's say from the perspective, say, China, in which in Marxism, both democratic equality and science have extreme value. And from that perspective, social progress enables the democratization of leisure. So, of course, Aristotle's and Plato's assumption was that only a small number of people can really have a fully human life. But whether we're Marxists or some other system, whatever, the point is, in the modern age, we have the expectation that everyone can have leisure. Everyone can at least have the weekends off and days off, maybe eventually 3-day work weeks, whatever. If that can happen, can we do like a kind of democratic rehabilitation of leisure theory?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, look, in the absence of scarcity and inequality, right? If we have resolved potentially catastrophic sort of socio-technical emergencies like climate change, right? I think the picture of what science is for changes, right? And certainly, right, a post-scarcity society like the one that Marx envisioned is one where the pursuit of art and curiosity and so on, leisure, if you want to call it that, becomes paramount. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so maybe we can be like further in that direction. Okay, good. Takahara.
Okay, let's move on to another question. If not, I can answer the question, of course. So thanks for this very provocative, important talk, I suppose. And I was wondering the initial distinction between aims and success of science. And I think that kind of demarcation is very important, and particularly to what extent science is successful. For example, as you exemplified, climate change and the climate scientists are not arguably successful in preventing the climate change or global warming. But scientists keep hypothetically thinking how to prevent climate change. So I suppose from your talk, aims are more fundamental than success of science, or vice versa. What do you think?
Oh, well, I think that's a good question. I think that, so when I'm talking about success, I'm primarily thinking about like what are the criteria for success. So I think in order to understand the potential value of science, you have to understand what science aims to do and what the criteria for success in meeting the aims is, right? And then to understand the actual value of science, you additionally need to know how often does it succeed, right? What is its sort of rate of meeting its own success criteria, right? And therefore achieving those aims. In fact, the case that, you know, you're right in a sense. If the sort of primary aim of climate science is solving the problem of global warming or catastrophic climate change, it's not very successful, right? Because it hasn't. I mean, we seem to be proceeding with abandon towards, crossing various thresholds, sort of irreversible thresholds, right? And I mean, my view is that part of the problem is something like the realist view about what climate science is supposed to be doing, right? That is, the very sharp dichotomy that's drawn, for example, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, between the scientific assessment process and the policy resolution process, right? These are seen as basically totally separate things, right? Is actually means that the science that gets produced is not as useful at solving the problems as it needs to be, right? And there is not the kind of cooperation between science and policymaking that there needs to be to produce either good solutions or good policy, good science or good policy, right? So for example, I've in collaborative work with another philosopher of science, Joyce Havstad, I've critiqued the way in which values are understood by the IPCC in its more recent sort of value sensitive approach to climate science, not in terms of the diversity of things that we care about when we're worried about climate, but the values are things like 1.5 degrees C target, 2 degrees C target, 4 degrees C target. So they're conceived in these highly technical, inaccessible ways, right? And I think that's part of the problem. I think a more pragmatist understanding of what we're trying to do in the science would lead to producing more fit for purpose science and a better relationship between science and policy.
Right. So success is more important than aims for pragmatists. Or
Well,
what do
I
you think?
mean, I think they go together, right? It's the success in meeting the aims, right? So you got to have both.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. It's. I think I have more questions, but yeah, I move on to another question because maybe some other audience probably.
Yes, colleague. Gentlemen, hello. My name is Yaroslav. Jason knows me. My question is, Matt, you said a lot about ethical part of science and ethical part of. So the thing is, as per my opinion, the result of science belongs only to those who's in charge, only to those who rules the world, and people who close to them. and but the result of any science do not belongs to to people who lives, for example, in a poverty, for example, somewhere in Bangladesh or some countries of Africa or some regions of Russia and stuff like that. So, talking about ethical part of any science, do you think that? So, sorry, I'm sorry. English is not is not my native. My native language is Russian. I'm trying to translate and keep the sense of the questions. Um, how, how do you think will ever the result of the science belong to the mass of the people, to the bigger part of the population of the Earth, or will it always belong only to the rich people? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, there's there's of course there's a gap between how it should be and how it is, right? So, I mean, um, there's lots of reasons to think the way it should be is that the result should, as you say, belong to everybody, right? I mean, for example, the right to science is sort of ensconced in the UN Framework Convention on Human Rights, right? It's the right to science is a fundamental human right, acknowledged by almost every country in the world, because almost every country in the world is a signatory of the Framework Convention. Um, uh, Robert Merton, the sort of classic sociologist of science, said that one of the fundamental norms of science is he called it communism in his original paper in 1942. He in later revisions, he started calling it communalism because of Cold War politics nonsense. But the idea that the results of science belong to everyone, right? That they're not owned by anyone, right? Um, so internal and external reasons for thinking that's the way it should be. Of course, the way it is falls far short of that in a number of ways, right? So one of the ways is the elitism of science, right? That is, science is proceeds in a highly technical and specialized way, and for the most part doesn't see itself as accountable to or in interaction with sort of broader non-specialist publics, right? Um, and even worse, right, when science is produced as, for example, with biomedical science in the United States, a lot of it is produced for by private companies for private companies and is kept secret or under patent restriction, right? Or in various other kinds of science is kept as the sort of private possession of governments, right? Of ruling classes of other kinds, right? Um, in I think one of his most important books, John Dewey, in The Public and Its Problems, worries very much about this, right? About the way in which scientific experts who are separated from the public or from publics become a kind of elite class that serves themselves and other elites, right? And I think this is a huge problem. This is a huge part of the way in which um, uh, populists and authoritarians of various stripes around the world have sort of have hampered or criticized or attacked science in various ways, right? Um, as well, right? Um, the sort of anti-intellectualism in America in the last couple of years is, I think, another example of this problem, right? And it comes from two sides. I mean, it comes from the alienation of a kind of elite, out of touch science that it creates in the larger public. So Jason was sort of getting at that in an earlier comment. And it also comes from the way in which a more publicly responsible, socially responsible science becomes a threat to power. Thank you for the question. It's a great question.
I have another question, if you mind.
Oh yeah, please. I think it's fine.
So my second question actually goes from the first one. In ancient Greece, there was a quote: "What is allowed to Jupiter is not allowed to the bull." It is about different classes of the of human of, of population, elites, oligarchs, workers, and stuff and people like that. So if it was the same 5,000 years ago, how can we say that there is a way how it should to be? If all human history we was not equal to each other. All human history there was elites, there was slaves. Slaves was the only right that slaves had is to die on a work, and while elites had all the rights they could ever even imagine, even the right of the first night with a bride, for example, it was in Europe. So can we say that all philosophic talks now, and especially about the way it should to be, and the talks about equality, is hypocritical according to all humankind history?
Oh, well, this is taking us a little far afield, but look, I mean, the fact that there was inequality 5,000 years ago and there's inequality now doesn't mean that it's exactly the same now as it was 5,000 years ago, right? It doesn't mean that. I think it's a crucial pragmatist point, right? The fact that we haven't achieved utopia doesn't mean we haven't made progress, right? I think there's a lot of progress in human history that we can identify. Even if we hadn't made progress, the fact that we can freely exercise our imagination means that we can imagine a better world, right? And so there's nothing hypocritical about it, articulating a vision for the future that's better than the way that things are now, in my view.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Suven?
Yes, I have a question. Professor Brown, thank you for your wonderful talk. And as you mentioned in your slides, practical reason is really part of value. And so I think your discussion about the relationship between science and values is very closely connected to philosophy of science in practice, or the practical turn in philosophy of science. And also we surely can find some examples, for example, like Heather Douglas, Philip Kitcher, and Helen Longino. But it seems like that in current philosophy of science in practice, values is still not discussed enough. It's not the key point or the key topic, I think, but maybe it should be. So could you please say a bit more about how value is understood from a perspective of philosophy of science in practice?
Yeah, good question. So so you're right to think that in philosophy of science today, there's a greater attention to practice, to scientific practice, as opposed to, say, mid 20th century philosophy of science, a lot of which was focused on sort of abstract technical analyses of mathematical and logical structure of theories, and there's even a lot more. There are a lot of people now pursuing explicitly pragmatist approaches in philosophy of science, right? And a lot of that work in both of those senses proceeds without explicit attention to issues of values, right? I think there's, I think there is maybe more attention to values in science in the science and practice folks than there is in philosophy of science more generally. That is, I think they're more open to the topic, and more people are doing that kind of topic. I think everyone who's working in most of the people who are working on values in science are doing it from a perspective of philosophy of science and practice. But I do think that there could be more of it. So I've actually written recently about the sort of new pragmatism in philosophy of science, and how, unlike the old pragmatists, there's not enough attention to issues of values, right? I'm thinking especially about Dewey, but also about people like Jane Addams and William James. And Peirce is kind of funny because it's sort of a direct consequence of his views that science is value laden, but he wants to deny it somehow. But anyway, I count him as part of the positive story about values in science, even though he doesn't want to be counted that way, according to some of his interpreters. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, it's helpful.
Yeah. And I know, so when you're interested in the work of Joseph Rouse in particular, and I think within the philosophy of science and practice, his is the view, I think, that's most compatible with everything I've been saying, right? That's most sort of explicit about the inherent value ladenness of science. Although he doesn't always use that terminology. I think that's what his view is. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you.
Oh. Could you share the title that you have published recently, on new pragmatism and something?
I don't know if it's come out yet. I submitted it a while ago, but I'll look up the title.
Okay, not yet fully published.
Let's see. That's the title is called. The paper is called "What is Pragmatist About the New Pragmatist Philosophy of Science?" And it's coming out in a journal called Res Philosophica.
Oh, very interesting to read in future.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe final questions. Any comments? Jason?
Yes. Again, I'd just like to say this is an extremely important topic, precisely because both science and progress are so much part of the modern world. And if we don't have a clear understanding about how science relates to ordinary human values, it's just not going to continue. We'll just keep coming up with these problems. And so I think it's what you're doing on this is just essential, in addition to the theoretical interest. And again, as a Peircean, I'm interested in making this seeing what kind of bridge we can make between Peirce's view of science and Dewey's view of science, which is more socially contextual.
Yeah. And it's really striking, exactly 100 years ago, we were in the early stages of the Lippmann and Dewey exchange or debate, right, that started with Lippmann's book, Public Opinion in 1922, and ended with Dewey's book, The Public and Its Problems in 1927. And the work from both of their positions, both sides of that discussion, is so relevant to what we're dealing with today, is still so alive. So, and I think that's yeah, I agree. It's very important. Thank you for saying so.
Matt, another question, please.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
About take into account everything what was said. If truth is the only thing which must work in pragmatism, how can how can we criticize the thing which brings profit to some group of people, even if it brings damage to population and their health, and it can destroy the society? Thank you.
Yeah, I just don't think that version of the pragmatist understanding of truth is right. I mean, maybe that's what some pragmatists think truth is, but I follow Dewey in thinking that truth has to do with what resolves problems in a sort of much broader sense, right? And that it has more to do with the sort of correspondence between what a claim or theory or model intends to bring about and what its actual sort of result in the world is. Right.
Right. Well, I think we can wrap up now. Taka?
Yeah. I think that Dewey's definition of truth is a right conclusion. And
Yes.
we will proceed with Deweyan and pragmatist traditions the next year ahead. So this is the final webinar for the 2025 webinar series. And thanks for your attention so far, and thanks again to Professor Brown.